Thanks for watching this video, which is a collaboration between Cosmolab, which is a series of video conversations for the China Knowledge Network from the Dutch government, which aims to encourage an exchange of worldviews and to take complexity seriously and to investigate how metaphysics, in the end, influences diplomacy, international relations, and policymaking. And in this episode, we'll be focusing on the worldview that is known as idealism, that holds the idea that the ground of existence is consciousness itself, which in Hindu and Buddhist philosophy goes under different names, but in the West is primarily known as analytic idealism. And my aim for this conversation is for you to have a better understanding after watching this of what idealism is and what the similarities and differences are between the Western analytic approach and the Eastern philosophical and religious approach. And I think we have the two guests to explore this. First of all, a very warm welcome to Professor Ram Prasad Chakravarti. You are a distinguished professor of comparative religion and philosophy at Lancaster University and fellow of the British Academy, and you are an absolute authority when it comes to Indian philosophy and comparative religion, and have written 8 books, amongst which the award-winning book Divine Self and Human Self on the Bhagavad Gita. A very warm welcome, Professor Ram. You said it's okay if I call you Ram from now on.
Please do.
So I'll do that. Very welcome, Ram. Secondly, we have Bernardo Kastrup. You are an analytic philosopher and AI engineer. You hold a PhD degree in both these disciplines. And you've become known for critiquing physicalism, materialism, some people know it, and proposing a more plausible metaphysics, namely analytic idealism. And differently than the traditions Professor Ram Prasad studies, your approach is very much rooted in analytic philosophy. And you also have written numerous books and scientific articles on this topic. You're director of the Essentia Foundation, which aims to share this analytic idealism with the world. And you just summarized over a decade of your work in a just released book called Idealism in a Nutshell. Very warm welcome to you as well, Bernardo.
Thanks.
And I thought very nice for our conversation between the two of you to first set the stage to go to sort of the root of idealism in the East and the West. And I'd like to start with you, Professor Ram, because I do think it starts earlier in the East than in the West, sort of idealism. But that's perhaps my lack of knowledge. But if I may ask you, could you please share with us some of the key ontological terms and the key ontology and also a bit of the epistemology when thinking about idealism and the East?
So I think what in some ways is characterized as idealism in modern Western thought, and also increasingly as panpsychism, gets articulated in a particular way very early on, as you point out, probably around 1000 BCE, in a set of texts called the Upanishads, which are largely in the form of dialogues and sort of teachings and learnings between various groups of people. And what happens in the Upanishads is very early on, the texts want to go past or beyond the sort of riotous plurality of the world of creatures and actions, the world of cows and cowherds, the world of thunder and lightning and kings and priests, the world of weddings and so forth. How do you go past what's behind all of this? They are no longer contented, as they see it, like the older texts before them, the Vedas were, in moving through this world and acting in a way that can bring some control to it. So they hit upon this idea that if we could understand the deeper structures of reality that lie behind all of this, then that knowledge will have massive consequences in the day-to-day world. And they call that ultimate reality that explains everything else Brahman, which comes out of a word which is roughly to bear, that which bears up everything else. Now, then a question comes up, well, what is the relationship between that reality and we who are contemplating it? And an answer, which is enigmatic, but which they propose, is that there is a deep mapping between the subject seeking to understand reality and that reality itself. And of course, that non-difference between the deepest self, called the Atman, from a word meaning, Indo-European word meaning breath, um, there is a mapping between that deepest self and that reality. And what characterizes us as inquiring beings, of course, is our awareness, is our consciousness, our subjectivity in relation to all that we experience. Therefore, if there is some fundamental mapping between us and that reality, and what makes us is our consciousness, then reality is also consciousness. So between Brahman and Atman, there is a mapping, and that mapping is explained by a consciousness which underwrites all the world of diversity. That doesn't get us very far because this is said, this only raises questions about exactly what is that mapping. And many centuries later, different schools of thought attempted to give different answers. Meanwhile, by the 5th century BCE, we have a challenge to this account from the Buddha. Now, the Buddha's main point is don't indulge in thinking about a system that will explain all of these things in terms of yourself. Many centuries later, engaged in this debate with later Hindu systems of thought, some Buddhists themselves start saying, well, what does it mean to say that the world is fleeting? What does it mean to say that we are fleeting beings? What is the relationship between them? And an answer that they give, and this is called the school of Yogacara, which emerges in the 3rd or 4th century of the Common Era, is to say that, in fact, subject and object, this sense of a continuous being and the sense of the world with which it interacts are kind of mutually constituted. And that constitution is an act of consciousness. So what you need to know right from the beginning is that it's not so easy as to be able to say whether this is idealism or not, but there is a certain kind of what might be called monism, an idea that there is one underlying principle, however it's constituted, whether it's eternal or momentary, whether it's stable or whether it's fleeting. And against it are what are dualisms, and we can come to that later.
I resonate with everything Professor Chakravarti has just said. It's a deja vu for me because not long ago I was in an event with Swami Sarvapriyananda, and the same model, we were both asked the same question. And every time I had the tendency to say, well, it's just what he said. So I have that tendency now. But I'll play my role and I say things in my own way, my own language, which is a language from the Western tradition of philosophy. Analytic idealism would say the following. There is an external world. It's really there. But it is mental. It is made of experiential states. It's made of conscious states. Just like your thoughts are outside from my point of view, but they are mental. They are not part of my mentation, but they also exist and they are mental, even though they are not part of my mind. In the exact same way, an analytic idealist would say, there is a world. It's really out there. It's not part of my mind, but it too is mental. And it presents itself to me when I observe it as what we colloquially call the physical world. In other words, the physical world is a sort of dashboard representation of the real world, which is mental. Just like an airplane has sensors that make measurements about the real states of the sky outside, and then presents those measurements in the form of dial indications on an airplane's dashboard, we have a dashboard. And sensors in our retinas, our eardrums, the surface of our skin. We also make measurements, and those measurements are presented to us also in the form of a dashboard. The dashboard is the screen of perception. So physicality, or the physical world, is in us. We create it. It's our cognitive way of representing information that we gather about the real world out there when we make a measurement, when we make an observation. But that real world isn't physical. It doesn't look physical. It is constituted of experiential states, which are not mine or yours, but they are also experiential. They are really out there. And the separation between us and the world is secondary. It's not fundamental. We are cognitively dissociated from the world. You know, people have dissociation. We know dissociation can happen even in a human mind. People can have dissociative identity disorder, in which consciousness seems to split into multiple disjoint centers of awareness. The individual self is just a narrative. It's the narrative self. It's I am this person who was born on that date. These are concepts. These are memories. These are contents of consciousness and not the subjectivity itself. The subjectivity itself is only one with multiple concurrent points of view. It's easy to understand that because we know we can transpose space and time. Since Einstein, we've known that. We all understand intuitively that subjectivity behind your eyes when you were 5 years old is the same subjectivity that looks out from your eyes today, even though you today have nothing to do with the you of 5 years old, when you were 5 years old. Not a single atom in your body has remained in your body ever since then. Your thoughts are different, your opinions are different, your body is different, everything is different. But the subjectivity is the same, and we don't have a problem with that. Now, if we transpose that to space, it's the same subjectivity, but now not in different points in time, but different points in space. And that's why I can be you and you can be me while you're still you and I'm still me. Just for the same reason that you could be your 5-year-old self and still be you. So that's the core idea. And it's, as far as I can determine, I'm not a scholar of Eastern philosophy. Eastern philosophy is a world unto itself. I do not have the pretension to say that I'm enough read in that literature and enough acquainted with that. It's much older than Western philosophy, considerably more nuanced and sophisticated. So I cannot say it's the same as the non-dualism of the Upanishads, as Advaita Vedanta, but I suspect it is.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amanda. It's very, very nice. And it really speaks to some thought I'm just literally working on now. The one important development of this that I left out happens from about the 9th, 10th century in what's called Kashmiri Shaivism. And there's a very important set of thinkers, the most important of whom is called Abhinavagupta. Now, Abhinava says almost exactly this. He says he does not want to take the line that, say, Advaita, non-dualism takes. Now, Advaita says a consequence of this metaphysical non-duality is that at some point, the ontological status of the world has to be undermined, has to be challenged, because it is plural, and the plurality is not ultimate, and therefore it's not real. He says, if you're granting the world, you're not saying it's a dream. You're saying that you do function within it. And, things like standards of moral conduct and so on require that. Then what is the point of giving with one hand the notion that this world is present as it is in our subjectivity, and then questioning its reality? It's real too. It's just that the nature of its reality is different from what the dualists think. Exactly. The nature of that reality is consciousness. The problem, therefore, for a dualist is to think that the consciousness that articulates itself through the use of the I am this, I am that, this kind of what the classical Indian philosophers called a conceit of I-hood. The classical Indian idea would be, I mean, what Bernardo is calling dissociation is what the lot of the classical Indian philosophers called this I making. And their point is that I making is what a particular form of subjectivity does. And that withdraws into itself and says, I am this. It privileges certain things that it says are not it, but related to it. Like I am, my body, I am tall, I have a white beard. Those kinds of things establish a particular relationality between a sense of I and its qualities. Now, it cuts both ways, this error. On the one hand, it constructs a subjectivity through association with certain things. That's one kind of problem. But the other problem is it cuts off subjectivity from the reality in which it finds itself by saying that it's an I that's cut out, is different from, is individuated by certain particular qualities. So it's a double-sided error, both generating a relationship with some aspects of the world as it finds itself, wrongly, and to locate subjectivity within it. So it's over-association in one way and dissociation in the other. A feature of Western and then global modernity has become this notion that the puzzle is why I find myself, I who can think about the world, find myself in this world. So it's almost the exact opposite of what the Upanishads found themselves in. So they were saying, what is that reality which relates to me? Whereas modernity says, what am I that I'm in relation to this reality? It brings with it this unquestioned assumption that we know where the problem lies. The problem lies with us, not with the world which we can understand. Once you go down that path, then you're forever trying to get out and thinking, how are we going to turn the question around? So it always seems in ordinary language, all over the world, in all kinds of cultures, an assumption, because we're all in the condition of modernity, that the problem is that there is a world which we can understand, in which we don't understand ourselves. Give us enough time and we'll understand ourselves in terms of that world. Rather than asking, well, why did you go down that particular trajectory in the first place? Despite all our analysis of Descartes' own reasoning, we have not given up that Cartesian framing which leads to this physicalism. And that is something that's as much found in India or anywhere else. If you look at it, for example, in the problems of psychiatry, for example, there is this thing where on the one hand, you want to throw up your hands and you have doctors say, oh, it's all in your head. It's all in the mind. Sorry, it's all in your mind, as a way of dismissing someone. And at the same time to say, here is a pill for your mind, just like there is a pill for the body, so that you kind of hold together this sense of dissociation in a double manner. And that, I'm sorry to say, doctors, whatever their background, whichever health system they work in the world, work within that kind of dualism. Whereas this sense of, hang on a minute, should we start rethinking these things? I must be very kind of, what shall I say, frank and confess that some of that power to say, let's rethink, has come in Western institutions, saying, let's look both at our own traditions and traditions around the world. When 30, 40 years ago, I was working on Advaita at Oxford, people looked at me blankly when I suggested ideas like the fundamental reality is consciousness. So I had to work on things like non-realism. Let's argue against the status of the external world. What is the nature of mental content? Now, some of the more far-thinking analytic philosophers in America talking to me about panpsychism and saying, here are these arguments that we have been ignoring for the last 130 years in the West itself, in Anglophone America and Britain. but you guys have been doing this in India for such a long time. And I kind of think, gosh, I should have been writing my thesis now. It would have been an easier task to not frame it to an extent for Indians in India. The greater divide is not between people like me who spent their working careers in the West. It's for people, I locate myself in that tradition, but for people in departments in India, where philosophy is in a powerless state in departments, to have the conviction that we don't need necessarily to be going through materialist, dialectic materialism or going back to certain forms of reductive analysis and say, let's look at this not in some, oh, we got that before you and we've got the mysteries of the world sorted, but rather in this engaged, epistemologically humble, egalitarian way of saying, let knowledge come forth from all directions and we will listen as much as we speak.
Beautiful. I've seen, Bernardo, I've seen you laughing for a bit. What's your take on what Ram just shared with us?
The reason we get confused is multifold. There is a hierarchy of traps. Some of them are linguistic, some of them are really authentic, some of them are epistemological. So let me just give you some examples. The first one is seemingly real illusions. It's not like the world is cheating on us. No, we are taking ourselves in, but there are authentic reasons for this. The example would be from analytic idealism, the notion that we are like pilots who were born in an airplane cockpit and the airplane has no windows. All we have is the dashboard. We only fly by instruments. That's reliable. We have to take the dashboard very seriously, otherwise we will crash and burn. In other words, step in front of a truck. But because all we have ever had was the dashboard, we think the dashboard is the sky. The dashboard is the world. That's when we say the world is physical. We are taking the dashboard for the thing the dashboard represents. We have to take the dashboard seriously, but not literally. So there is structure in the world, and we scan that structure in a way that we call space-time, because it's our way to organize information about the world such that we don't get overwhelmed by it. It's our filing system, our filing of drawers and cabinets, where we put things in neat drawers called the far past, the recent past, the present, the near future, and the far future. But if you understand that, then you cannot describe the world through language, because space-time is built into language. So you make a concession and you pretend that there is space-time out there. And then you say things like events happen. That would be Kashmiri Shaivism. Events happen. Western philosophy is in the dilemma that we do not have direct paths. We do not have a tradition of introspection. We have a tradition of articulation. So we are condemned to talking about penultimate truths. And our challenge is to be as little wrong as possible, to make as few inaccuracies as possible, knowing that we are going to commit inaccuracies. And sometimes we fall for those. We forget that we are making compromise, and we start believing those compromises as if they were really true. This happened to me a couple of times. And when I realized that I was really scared, because you see how you can take yourself in and start falling for things. But that is a hierarchy of pitfalls, and that's what makes it also difficult.
You're right. What these traditions then do is very quickly arrive at the conclusion about the limits. And they understand that you need to be able to first construct and then deconstruct, but deconstruction itself is still part of the same conceptual structures. So all you can do is to keep slowly dissolving the errors you held on to. So you're aware of it. It becomes sort of a meta-reflexive process. But you can't go, if, one of the things Abhinav says is that if it's not like there is a duality that you then get rid of, because there never was a duality. So what do? It says, well, it's like casting off a cloak. It's just that your thoughts no longer have the obstruction of your consciousness no longer has the obstruction of the thoughts with which you cloak it in order to go through the world. Do you have the courage for it? Can you throw it off? So I was, when I read it, I was just laughing to myself to say, well, here is a way of reading inside out the story of the emperor having no clothes. In a sense, we are all emperors without clothes who think we have them.
Yeah.
It's not just that sagacious boy who points it out. So that requires practice. So I was recently writing a paper on Kashmiri Shaivism saying, why does panpsychism require practice? Now, exactly as you're saying, Bernard, the lot of people are willing to push themselves to the point of asking these fundamental questions about what might turn out to be misunderstandings about the nature, of reality. But what do you do? How do you start making what Abhinav calls reasoning on the real a particular kind of practice? And that practice is partly about this, the deconstruction, which is itself constructive, but you got to do other things. You got to behave in a way. You have to bring your consciousness to a particular way of functioning. You have to conduct your life in a way that takes you through that reality as you see it. It's, for example, kind of thing that you find in China, in Zhuangzi, his form of Taoism, where there might be a metaphysical view behind it or not. The tradition doesn't do the kind of elaborate epistemological system building that Indian or Western traditions have done. But when you hear Zhuangzi's stories, the Jew goes to see famously the butcher Ding, and what he finds with the butcher Ding is that when he uses his knife, he's not even paying attention, and yet the parts of the meat that he's cutting simply fall apart. And says, "What skill? How do you pay attention to it?" And Ding says, "No, I don't. When I first started, I used to hack away until I hit the bone. Then I stopped seeing the whole of the animal that I was cutting and looked only at the joints and went along it. And then I got to the point where my knife simply follows where the hollows are and where the bones are. So it's no longer it's not a skill that I'm pursuing. I just cut where the cut is." That system, I think perhaps in Taoism, and especially in Chuang-Tzu, more than perhaps any other system, takes you very quickly down to saying it's up to you to do the system building, but this is the way you need to live as a consequence of it.
Look, I believe very strongly that the link between the Western tradition and the Vedic tradition is more than merely linguistic. It's more than just the Indo-European proto-language. I think there's a lot more to it. And yet, those two branches of what was a common origin, of course, express themselves differently. They are fated to arrive at the same conclusions because there is one thing that is true, right? Even if you say nothing's true, then that is the truth. There is always something that is the case. They will arrive at the same tradition, but the same conclusions ultimately, but they express themselves differently, especially epistemically. I think for the Western mind, for one reason or another, good or bad, we have come to a point where the intellect has become the bouncer of intuition or the bouncer of the heart. In other words, what the intellect doesn't validate doesn't sink in. It doesn't start really modulating the way you live, the way you feel, the way you act in the world. So for the Western mind, it's important to have a penultimate, but analytic, explicit, precise articulation of how and why these things might as well be true, that the subjectivity in you is the subjectivity in me, and why that doesn't contradict any of science, doesn't contradict the existence of a world, any of that. We need an explicit articulation of that, and the Western philosophical tradition tries to do that. But then the second step, which is the step I never thought would happen to me. I have a friend who is a Kashmiri Shaivist, Rupert Spira. And years ago, we were having dinner, and I told him, I understand all these things here, but I still feel bad. It doesn't inform my life. And he said, it will sink in. You cannot avoid it. It will happen. I said, but Rupert, I don't have I don't follow any tradition. I don't have any discipline other than to read and underline and thinking about it while I'm walking in the mountains. And he said, it will happen. And I didn't believe him. And then it did happen. And then it sunk in. So I needed that intellectual permission. And I think most of the Western minds need that intellectual permission. For the Western mind, it's easier to understand the Atman/Brahman through addition. For the Eastern mind, it's easy to understand through neti, not this, not that, subtraction. You arrive at the same place. The only criteria is if you start subtracting, you cannot stop. You have to keep on subtracting. Nothing survives that. And if you start adding, you cannot stop. There is no boundaries. You have to keep on adding. So to say that the true self is not this, not that, is the same thing as to say that the true self is all of it. For the Western mind, the latter is epistemically more amenable, I think. The Eastern mind is much less willing to compromise on what is true. It's a much more direct, uncompromising path to what is true. Although it has mythology, it's less tolerant of metaphor and perhaps this is what I mean, but not quite. No. It's really, a straight shot. It's easier for them to negate. That it's not this, it's not that, because all of these are forms of self-deception. For the Western mind, it's easier to say, well, keep on deceiving yourself until nothing is left. You are all of it. And suddenly you realize that it's the exact same thing. That at the end, everything happens in nothing. And that's what is actually going on. Nothing. And everything resides in it.
Thank you, Bernardo. Yeah.
That's interesting. I think the one thing I would say is I accept that. I see the point of the contrast. I'd probably say a little bit more that it's not so much East and West as about modernity. The one thing I would say is, after all, you go back to the Indian, system, things, ancient Indian science, about mathematics, which discovers both discovering zero and discovering infinity become two faces of the same thing, which is another metaphor for what you're saying, Bernardo. Yeah. But you also have, the astronomers in the 4th, 5th century onwards who were drawing on Greek geometry, but were using it in a mathematical way that, of course, by the 13th, 14th century was already getting at some of the things that anticipated what, Kepler and others found about, for example, the challenging the geocentric model of the world and so forth. The reason why we joke about, not joke, we kind of find the irony in Alexander cutting Gordian's knot is the point is not that. That just shows how you failed, right? So you need to unknot it. And that's why, of course, in China, we call it the Tao, the way. So it's walking. The way opens as you walk it. So in that sense, and every religious tradition says the same thing. It's not enough for you to read the Quran and declare its revelation. You have to live every day through patient understanding and read all the great scholars who have gone before you, not have the arrogance to think I can pick up the book and say that I now understand the religious text. To be a proper believer is to have a lifelong devotion and practice. That's what it is. Not enough to just say, this is God and, I'm the humble servant of God. That's not enough, right? And that's what all these traditions are. So how you do it might be through reading these texts and waiting for a particular kind of dawning of a sense of self. So I think it's fair to say that we shouldn't be undermined. It's just as bad as saying, I have no space and no time for all your spiritual nonsense, I'm a scientist. Each side is wrong in saying one or the other, but rather to coexist through these magisterial, invocations of reality.
I think nice for sort of the last part of our conversation to move on to sort of more the practical or ethical implications of metaphysics. If we look at the East and the West, does idealism or physicalism play out in the end differently in how states operate and how systems operate?
So a little while ago, I devised a piece of first-year undergraduate international relations theory called decentering international relations, where I said the thing is that where we function now is irretrievably a condition of the nation state, right? So whether, whatever country it is and whatever its history, right now, realism is the rational response to the nation state. So the first thing we need to do is allow the legitimacy of realist thinking, international realist theory thinking, in other traditions. So, for example, in China, we have seen the emergence of what's called the Tsinghua school, which essentially interprets certain ideas about Confucianism as a way of explaining a global system, in which, of course, it turns out that China is still the Middle Kingdom. You have, for example, in Turkey, this interpretation of the Ottoman inheritance, which takes the Islamic thought as it was articulated at the height of the Ottoman Empire and take Turkey to be the inheritor of that empire. And of course, at a time when they ruled the Middle East, they ruled all the Arab people and so forth, to say, well, how do we justify Turkey's domination now? And it becomes a narrative of challenging, say, the oil wealth of Saudi Arabia and so on. We got to allow, first of all, that international realist thinking is equally rooted in the self-interest of non-Western countries too. So we need to bring that pluralism in. Very interestingly, some thinkers about China have been talking about a Taoist model. So that they're saying, let's look at it internationally, but the fundamental principles of interaction and intersubjectivity are fundamentally different in these Taoist models compared to the Confucian ones. Not necessarily saying this is what Confucius said or this is what Lao Tzu said or whatever, but rather to say these models emerge so that there can actually be a China-grounded way of a debate that in the West would be read as the debate between idealist and realist models of international relations. And the same thing happens in India to say, oh, are we going to look at Kautilya and the Arthashastra on the one hand, and do we look at Ashoka's model or other kinds of models? And therefore, what you need for the moment, I think, is for there to be a flourishing of different models rooted in people's own ancestral identity, and for each, range of diplomats to become aware of how others might be thinking, that there might be genuine forms that we might identify in the West as idealist. Or you could say, oh, well, they're realists, but they are doing it in a slightly different way. So unless we have a real mapping of what you're calling epistemological diplomacy, we cannot be able start thinking through what the other person means. Otherwise, you're constantly, as we have seen in so many catastrophic failures of diplomacy, we are trying to map on a particular set of movements that have been developed in our own intellectual tradition, say in Britain, and trying to say, well, how does that map on to what the Chinese diplomats are telling me? And then the Chinese diplomats are kind of saying the only way they're going to understand it is through metaphorical, not intellectually grounded things. So we start having things about, the wolf diplomat and all of that kind of idea. So you kind of we collapse back into mutual incomprehensibility and the hermeneutic of suspicion.
Mm.
So I think the first thing we need to do is to let multiple ways of thinking about the metaphysical orientation of people in what is now insuperably a nation state world system, but allow people to rethink the past for the present in these different cultural forms.
It is true that under any form of non-dualism or objective idealism, analytic idealism, um, the subjectivity behind your eyes is the subjectivity behind mine. It's the subjectivity behind the eyes of Xi and the one behind the eyes of Putin. This is true. But a lot of people tend to interpret this as meaning that we should all go hold hands and sing the Kumbaya, which is one of the straightest ways to hell. It's a way to catastrophe, not only because whoever does that would be taken advantage of immediately, but because history has shown us that deterrence, the credible willingness and capacity to use force, has prevented conflict. It has prevented major conflict in Europe for 80 years until 2.5 years ago. So I don't think that the conclusion from this realization that there is only one subjectivity and it's behind the eyes of everybody, the conclusion is not that we should go and hold hands and sing the Kumbaya. The conclusion is that we are inherently capable of understanding everybody else's point of view and what drives everybody else. We have this dangerous ideology these days that what we consider morally censurable are things that we cannot relate to. Now, evil is over there, not here, and I'm proud of not understanding what drives those devils. This is incredibly dangerous. Not only do you not understand what the next movement of evil will be, you are proud of not understanding it. You are proud of being incapable of predicting it, of being incapable of reacting appropriately to it. And I think that's what idealism and non-dualism tells us. We should not be proud of not understanding the acts that we consider morally censurable. We should, on the contrary, make every effort we can to slide into those shoes, to understand what is driving them. It's to do that is not to validate what they are doing. It's not to acquiesce to it. It's to understand it. We should not erect barriers of understanding. We should not be proud of not understanding. We are capable and we should understand because we are there. That we are doing that. So we should understand it here too and act accordingly.
The infinite capacity for imagination is probably the greatest boon and the greatest curse of humanity. You know, my dog is very clever in many ways, as these dogs go, but she never does anything crazy. Humanity is capable of that. That's because that's what is the way consciousness is articulated in this dissociated way of, of I-ness lies only with us. And look at where we have brought ourselves for good and ill. So that means that every text, whether it's a written text or the world is text, is capable of being read in dramatically opposed ways, as has always been the case. So I'm not surprised by that. I'm not surprised by that. But what can we do? One kind of response, of course, is the time-honored response of careful scholars, of intellectuals. And we should never give that up, but to try and live a life of understanding. And, exactly as Bernardo says, it's that was Gandhi's idea, that he saw in the Gita the oneness of the Atman, because when Krishna says, ultimately, the killing and the being killed, they're all coming back to me. I'm the one. All these warriors you see are already dead. They're all part of the same cosmic procession. But what Gandhi took out of that was quite the opposite of how it could be read as a text for martial action. Instead, he took that and said, that means that the Englishman is not different from me. The Englishman is not incomprehensible to me. That the Englishman is not part of the dharma of the world. So it is really striking that, of course, in the history of Hindu society itself, dharma has been used to hierarchize, to relentlessly other, to pull apart people, to other them. It still happens. So it's not surprising that Trump does that, or indeed that a lot of people think, even in India, that Trump's victory is a legitimate one, like the American people themselves have this time. And yet you also have the ways of thinking, let's think of dharma as a way that overcomes differences, that refuses to other, that actually makes it a starting point that there is no otherness, that it's only my vulnerability and your vulnerability which are part of the same consciousness which underlies us all. We all live in that situation. Where is the liberation that knowledge gives us? That was the title of my first book, Knowledge and Liberation, in Classical Indian Thought. That's the ongoing project of our own lives. If there's one small thing we can do, one act that calls for otherness, which is overcome by thinking about that indivisibility between us, is one small victory in our moral lives within that universal consciousness.
Thank you very much, Ram. I think this is a beautiful end to our conversation. And Bernardo, thanks also very much for this conversation. Thanks very much for watching, and enjoy all the other videos brought to you by Cosmolab. And perhaps our Essentia Foundation will keep on collaborating with Cosmolab on videos like these. So thanks for watching. And yeah, thanks, gentlemen.